I was setting the last tray on the buffet table when I noticed my seat was gone. Not moved, gone. A folded card on a cheap plastic chair near the kitchen read, "Family help." My sister-in-law, in her silk blouse and smirk, raised her glass and said, "We figured you'd be more comfortable near the serving area." My husband didn't look up. Not once. I stood there, holding the gravy spoon, heart pounding with shame, until I noticed my son slip away with something in his hand. Quiet. Focused. And not coming back empty-handed. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it all. Maybe I had simply forgotten to place my own name card at the table. Maybe this was all just some harmless oversight. But then the laughter came, that soft, cultured kind of laughter rich people do when they're pretending their cruelty is a joke. My brother-in-law chuckled under his breath. His wife leaned over and whispered something to my husband that made him finally smile. Not at me, of course. Just a little twitch of the lips at her comment. That made it worse. The chair they had assigned to me wobbled on one leg. It faced away from the table, like a punishment stool. I stared at it for a few seconds too long, clutching the steaming dish in my hands, and not a single person made room for me. It was as if the very act of sitting with them required an invitation I had somehow lost over the years. I placed the dish down carefully, straightened my blouse, and walked toward the plastic chair without saying a word. They didn't offer me a seat at the table, so I wouldn't beg for one. I could hear the silverware clinking as I sat. Someone made a comment about the turkey being a bit dry. Another complained that the cranberry sauce was store-bought tasting. No one said thank you. No one acknowledged that I'd spent all morning in their kitchen. That the pies were made from scratch. That I'd ironed the napkins and arranged the centerpieces and even remembered that Aunt Lila was allergic to walnuts. None of it mattered. Not when I wasn't a real part of the family in their eyes. My hands rested in my lap as I tried not to let the tears sting. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I'd learned long ago how to make invisibility a shield. I could sit in a room full of people who claimed to love me and still feel like furniture. Useful, but forgotten. Present, but faceless. Across the table, my son looked confused. His brow furrowed the way it does when he's solving a math problem. He looked between my empty spot at the table and the lonely plastic chair I'd been given. His little fists clenched. No one else noticed. They were too busy asking my husband about his latest project at work. He was bragging about some upcoming promotion, and they all nodded like trained seals. My son didn't speak, but he slowly pushed back his chair and stood. His movement was subtle, deliberate. He slipped his hand into his coat pocket and walked out of the room without a word. I watched him go. He didn't look back, and I didn't stop him. Whatever he was doing, I knew better than to interrupt. He had the same look in his eye I'd seen once before, last year, when a teacher wrongly accused him of cheating on a test. He had walked into the principal's office the next day with 3 time-stamped drafts of his essay and the classmate who had actually stolen his work. He didn't yell. He just brought facts. The teacher apologized in front of the entire staff. Meanwhile, back at the table, my sister-in-law poured herself more wine and sighed theatrically. "It's so nice to have everyone together," she said, as if we were all part of some idyllic postcard moment. I could feel the sarcasm sticking to my skin like smoke. She turned slightly toward me, her voice rising just enough. "Farah, do you mind checking if the pies are warmed? You're so good at timing things like that." There it was again. The knife wrapped in a compliment. I nodded, stood up, and walked back toward the kitchen like the good little helper they had decided I was. As I passed the table, I heard someone murmur something about keeping busy and knowing your place. A few chuckled. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. I opened the oven door even though I knew the pies were already perfect. Just to give my shaking hands something to do. That's when I noticed the empty plate near my husband's side. He hadn't served me a portion. He hadn't even glanced at me to ask if I wanted any. I had cooked it all, and yet I was expected to serve myself from the sidelines, like a caterer who'd overstayed her shift. From the kitchen, I watched them eat. The room looked beautiful, golden and warm with candlelight and polished crystal glasses. But I'd never felt colder. I should have been used to it by now. The subtle digs, the polite distance, the way they'd always refer to me as, "She really holds things together," instead of using my name. But this felt different. This felt like a final line being drawn in a very public place. Someone knocked a spoon off the table, and I moved to pick it up automatically. But just as I bent down, I heard the sound of the front door opening. It was quick and clean, not like someone sneaking back in, but like someone who had found exactly what they were looking for and returned with purpose. Footsteps. 2 sets. I stood slowly and turned toward the hallway. The talking at the table dimmed slightly, just a notch, as if their collective instincts caught a shift in the air. My husband paused mid-sentence, cocked his head, and looked toward the doorway. Everyone followed his gaze. And then my son stepped back into the dining room. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman in a navy blazer, hair pulled into a tight bun, carrying a slim folder in one hand and wearing an expression that made the whole room tense without understanding why. My son walked forward, calm as ever, and simply said, "Mom, is now a good time?" The room went still. Even the clinking stopped. I didn't move. I just looked at him. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't the only one who had been watching. For a few seconds after my son spoke, the room stayed silent, caught between confusion and tension. My husband blinked, clearly trying to place the woman beside our son. No one moved. Not even my sister-in-law, who was normally quick to take control of a room. I could feel everyone waiting. For me, for a reaction, for some sign that this moment was just a misunderstanding. But I gave them nothing. I simply nodded once. That was all he needed. She stepped forward quietly, not announcing herself yet, just scanning the room with quiet professionalism. It wasn't just her presence that unsettled the room, it was the fact that my son stood beside her, calm, steady, proud. And it wasn't a performance. He wasn't playing some childish prank. There was something deeper here, something planned. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. No one knew that 3 weeks ago, I had finally answered a question my son had asked me far too often. Why do they treat you like that? I never gave him the real answer. I always smiled and said it didn't matter, that we were lucky to have family. But that day, when he caught me crying in the laundry room with a shredded invitation in my hand, the one for his cousin's birthday party that I'd accidentally never received, I stopped lying. I told him the truth. I told him that sometimes people only respect the noise, not the silence. That being kind makes you invisible in families where cruelty is dressed up as tradition. That for years, I thought being useful would earn me love. I told him that it hadn't. I expected him to cry. He didn't. He asked me to trust him. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. My son started asking very specific questions about money, about property, about my education. He asked where the deed to our house was kept, and if it was true that I used to work in law. I thought he was just trying to understand the world around him better. But now, watching him stand there so composed next to a woman who clearly wasn't family, I knew he'd been building something. Quietly. On his own. My husband finally spoke. His voice was too loud, like he was trying to reassert authority over a room that no longer listened. "What's going on here? Who is this?" His tone was half confusion, half warning. The woman turned her head slightly toward him but didn't answer. Instead, she turned to me. "Farah," she said gently, "we can begin whenever you're ready." She was giving me the choice. She wasn't here to steal the stage. She was here because someone had invited her, and not just anyone. My son. A child who had seen enough. And so I sat back down in the wobbly plastic chair they had assigned me, not because I accepted it, but because it made the contrast sweeter. Let them see me in this ridiculous seat. Let them remember how they treated me, before they realized what I had quietly become. They still didn't know. They had no idea that I had spent the past 7 years rebuilding the life I'd paused. That while they gossiped about my lack of ambition, I had passed the bar exam again under my maiden name. That I had slowly invested a portion of my grandmother's inheritance into a small but thriving legal consultancy firm that specialized in financial investigations and asset tracing. That I hadn't taken a penny from my husband in nearly 5 years. None of them knew I was no longer financially dependent on anyone in that room. Not even my husband. He thought the money I used for groceries came from his account. It didn't. I had let him think that, the same way I let him believe he held all the power. Sometimes you keep quiet not because you're weak, but because silence is a better place to plan. My sister-in-law finally broke the awkward silence. Is this about the chair? Farah, if you're upset, we can fix it. It was just a little mix-up. We thought you liked helping out. I looked at her then, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't even feel angry. I felt something colder, cleaner, like clarity. She had no idea how deep the damage ran, or how little I needed from her now. The woman beside my son opened the folder. She didn't speak, just rested it on the table, where the linen runner and gold-trimmed plates looked suddenly ridiculous. My husband stepped closer, eyebrows drawn. Seriously, what is this? He said again, but the irritation had cracked into something else. Something more nervous. He glanced at me, then at our son. He didn't like the silence. He didn't like not knowing who was in control. He was used to my obedience, my soft retreat from conflict. But I didn't move. My son looked directly at his father and said, "You said Mom doesn't need anything because she's just the help. But she built something while you weren't looking." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered like fact. And facts don't need volume. There were so many things I wanted to say in that moment. To scream or list every hurt I had buried. But I didn't. My silence said more than any speech could. I saw my husband falter, just slightly. A tiny shift in the shoulders. He was starting to realize this wasn't just a dinner gone wrong. This was a reckoning. As the woman began sliding a series of documents across the table, statements, transactions, copies of emails, I could see the blood drain from my brother-in-law's face. He glanced at one, then leaned over to whisper something to my husband. My husband waved him off, then turned back to me with a thin smile. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're embarrassing the family." I stared straight at him. "No," I said. "I'm just finally telling the truth in a room that never wanted to hear it." Behind me, I heard the oven beep. The pies were ready. And for the first time in years, I didn't move to get them. No one reached for the documents. Not at first. It was as if touching them would confirm something they weren't ready to face. My sister-in-law blinked rapidly, her wine glass trembling slightly in her hand. My husband's jaw clenched, the practiced calm he always wore at family events slipping at the edges. And my son, my sweet quiet boy, stood as steady as a stone, watching every reaction, eyes sharp, lips pressed into a firm line. I had always taught him not to be loud. But I had also taught him not to be blind. The woman beside him, her name was Ms. Haroon, I later learned, began to speak. Her voice was measured, almost gentle, but the words cut cleaner than any raised voice ever could. "I've been retained on behalf of Mrs. Farah, and her legal interests regarding joint assets and intellectual property developed during her time in this household." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Joint assets. Intellectual property. Suddenly, the room full of people who had spent years dismissing me as someone who didn't work, looked like they'd swallowed glass. My husband laughed, too loudly. "This is ridiculous. What property? She doesn't even have a job." He gestured toward me like I was a lost cause someone should claim. "She's not an attorney anymore, she makes cupcakes. That's what she does. She bakes." That was true. I did bake. I also ran a legal consultancy firm that handled asset protection for mid-sized businesses across 3 cities. The cupcakes were just easier for them to digest. It kept their world in order, where I stayed small and sweet and out of the way. Ms. Haroon didn't flinch. She opened the folder again and slid forward another document. Here's a licensing agreement. The branding and recipes Farah created under her name were filed and protected 2 years ago. Your brother has since used them for profit under a different business name, one that Mrs. Farah traced back to your joint family account. The brother-in-law in question dropped his fork. My husband's voice dropped low. What the hell is this? You've been spying on us. Protecting herself, the woman said calmly. Your wife retained counsel 2 years ago when she realized that her unpaid labor and intellectual contributions were being quietly monetized through your family's side business. She chose not to pursue action until now, out of consideration for her son's peace of mind. All eyes turned to my son. He didn't shrink from the attention. He didn't hide behind me. He stood there, hands in his pockets, calm. She was never just the help, he said again. And I'm not letting you keep pretending she was. There was a kind of stillness in the room, like after the last bell rings but before the first person gets up. You could feel years shifting, slowly coming undone. My husband sat down without realizing it. His sister looked as if she might speak, but thought better of it. I hadn't said much. Not really. But everything that needed to be said was already on the table, in front of them, in black and white. I watched my husband read the first page. Then the second. His face changed as he scanned each line, his posture slowly collapsing under the weight of the realization. These weren't accusations. These were facts. Traced, documented, dated. The signature on the licensing transfer belonged to him. He had signed it without reading, assuming it was something mundane I needed his name on, back when he still believed I couldn't read legalese. Back when he didn't care. He finally looked up at me, eyes wide. You tricked me. I tilted my head. No. You ignored me. That's different. My brother-in-law cleared his throat. Let's not get carried away. We can talk about this, surely. You don't want to blow up the family over some paperwork. That word, paperwork, like it was trivial. Like my years of unpaid work, emotional labor, recipe testing, branding, packaging, late-night budgeting, and filing were just some hobby I'd over-glorified. You already did, I said softly. You just never thought I'd notice. My son stepped forward then, placing a single folded piece of paper in front of his father. Not a legal document. Just a receipt. The same one I had paid with when I quietly picked up the tab for the entire Thanksgiving dinner. Catering, floral arrangements, even the imported wine his sister liked to brag about. I'd paid for all of it. Not from our joint account. From my own. She paid for everything, my son said. And she didn't even get a seat. The weight of that sentence hit differently. Not just because of the money, but because it made everything they had done to me visible. The folding chair. The passive-aggressive jokes. The silence at the table. It had all felt normal to them. But now, with just a sentence from a child, it looked ugly in the light. Still, no one apologized. Not yet. My husband looked down at the receipt, then at the documents, then at me. You've been planning this? No, I answered. I was just tired of being erased. A long, heavy pause fell across the table. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else whispered, "Wow," under their breath. The woman beside my son calmly began to place everything back in her folder, her job nearly done. She looked at me. I gave a small nod. And she turned to leave. But just as she stepped away, my husband spoke again. His voice had lost its edge. "What do you want?" he asked. "What is this?" I stood up from the plastic chair. It creaked slightly as I rose, but I didn't mind. It had served its purpose. I met his eyes. "Nothing," I said. "I just wanted you all to see what silence builds when no one's looking." I turned toward the door, my son following me without a word. But as we stepped out of the dining room, I heard my sister-in-law whisper something I hadn't expected. She was never just a housewife, she said. We just couldn't stand that she never asked us for anything. I almost stopped walking. But I didn't. Because I knew what was coming next. And they weren't ready. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in that house in years. My son walked beside me, silent but tall, his small hand brushing against mine before he slipped his fingers into my palm. I didn't squeeze right away. I just let the moment settle, the sound of muffled voices still echoing behind the front door we had just closed. Something final had happened in there, and we both knew it. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a shift in gravity. For the first time, the truth hadn't been hidden behind my silence. It had spoken for itself. We reached the car parked across the driveway. I leaned against it for a moment, not ready to drive, not ready to move. My son looked up at me with a calmness that both steadied and broke me. "You okay?" he asked, like it was his turn to take care of me now. I nodded slowly, the weight of years melting down my spine. "I'm not angry," I said softly, mostly to myself. "Just done." Inside, I could still see the silhouettes shifting in the windows. No shouting, no dramatic storm-offs. Just confusion, awkward pacing, people unsure of where to look, what to say. That was how quiet justice worked. It didn't need to scream. It just made sure the people who hurt you couldn't pretend they didn't know what they'd done. The door opened. My husband stepped out, his suit jacket half-buttoned, phone in hand like a shield. He looked smaller than usual, not physically, but in presence. Like the spotlight had finally shifted and he didn't know what to do without it. He called my name, but I didn't move. I waited. He walked down the steps, carefully, watching me like I might explode. Or vanish. "Farah," he said. "Look, this got out of hand. We don't have to do this now. We can go inside talk. Please." His voice wasn't cruel anymore. It was cautious. Controlled. As if he'd just realized the walls he'd leaned on were paper. I let him speak, but I didn't respond right away. I wanted the silence to sit with him like it had sat with me for years. I watched him squirm under it, the way I had while they made their jokes and passed me like wallpaper. Now he was the one outside the conversation, unsure of his place. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You should have said something. You didn't have to bring." He gestured vaguely toward the house, where Ms. Haroon was likely collecting her things. "A lawyer. You embarrassed everyone." I looked at him, straight this time. "You embarrassed me every day for a decade. I just returned the favor. Once." He blinked, taken aback. Not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Truth always hit harder when you weren't used to hearing it out loud. "I didn't know you felt that way," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "You never asked." A beat passed between us. A long one. I saw his eyes search mine for softness, for some trace of the woman who once stood beside him quietly at every family event, smiling even as she was erased. But she wasn't there. She had stopped pretending. "I still love you," he said. It didn't sting. It didn't move me. It sounded like a script someone had handed him when the audience didn't clap. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the car door, my hand still wrapped around my son's. He didn't let go. Not once. Behind us, the front door opened again. My sister-in-law stepped out, arms crossed. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at her brother, then at me. Her gaze wasn't cruel this time. It was confused. Or maybe regretful. I couldn't tell. Maybe it didn't matter. She walked halfway down the steps and said, "I didn't think it would matter to you. The chair. The jokes. You always seemed fine." I turned slightly toward her. "That's because you never looked closely enough." She hesitated, then said quietly, "I'm sorry." Not loud. Not performative. Just a flicker of decency, late but honest. I nodded once, not to forgive her, but to let her know I'd heard. And then I drove. We didn't talk much on the way home. My son played with the cuff of his jacket, staring out the window. I focused on the road, though my thoughts kept trailing back to everything I had swallowed for the sake of peace. Every dismissal. Every eye roll. Every moment they made me feel like a guest in my own life. It was all behind me now, not forgotten, but released. When we pulled into the driveway, I didn't rush inside like I usually did. I sat in the car for a moment, listening to the engine tick in the silence. My son finally broke it. Will things be different now? I looked at him. They already are. We walked into the house, not in a hurry, not checking our phones for messages. The house felt warmer, somehow. Quieter, but not in the lonely way. In the kind of way that makes you feel like your name means something again. Before I headed upstairs, I opened the side drawer near the kitchen and took out the place card. The one they had labeled, Family Help. I hadn't thrown it away yet. I'd folded it in half and tucked it beside my keys, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I wanted to remember. I walked outside, barefoot on the porch, and stood for a moment under the sky that didn't need permission to shine. Then I tore the card once, then again, and let the wind take the pieces. My son stood at the door, arms crossed. You hungry? I smiled. Starving. He grinned. I saved you the best slice of pie. You made it after all. I sat down at the kitchen table, the real one, not the folding one near the garbage bins. And for the first time in a very long time, I ate like someone who belonged. Because I did. And now they all knew it.